told you, Dracula was not just a story. Not just a vampire with fangs. Not just a monster hiding in the dark. But a real man. A prince. A ruler. A warrior so brutal that even his enemies were terrified to speak his name. And the worst part, the real Dracula might have been more horrifying than the legend. Tonight, we're not talking about fiction. We're talking about history. And once you hear what he actually did, you may never look at the name Dracula the same way again. Before he became a legend, before the fangs, before the cape, before the word vampire was ever connected to his name, there was just a boy. His real name was Vlad III. He was born in 1431 in a cold stone fortress in Transylvania. Yes, that Transylvania. But it wasn't the mysterious, fog-covered land you see in movies. It was a battlefield. Empires were constantly fighting for control. Borders shifted. Armies marched. Betrayal was common. And Vlad was born right in the middle of it. His father was a powerful nobleman named Vlad II. But people didn't call him that. They called him Dracula. In Old Romanian, that word meant dragon. He was part of a secretive military group called the Order of the Dragon, an elite brotherhood sworn to defend Christianity against invading forces. It was a symbol of power, of strength, of fearlessness. So, naturally, young Vlad became known as Dracula, which didn't mean vampire. It meant something much simpler. Son of the Dragon. At first, it sounded noble, heroic even, but his childhood would strip away any innocence he had. When Vlad was just a young boy, around 11 years old, everything changed. His father made a political deal with the Ottoman Empire. To prove loyalty, he handed over something priceless, his own sons. Vlad and his younger brother were taken hostage. Imagine that for a second. You're a child. You're ripped away from your home, from your mother, from everything familiar, and you're sent to live among your father's enemies. They weren't prisoners in chains, but they weren't free either. They were watched, controlled, threatened. If their father stepped out of line, they would suffer. Some historians say Vlad was treated harshly. Others say he received military training. But one thing is certain. He grew up surrounded by violence, executions, torture, war strategy, power games, and fear. Lots of fear. That kind of environment doesn't create softness. It creates survival instinct. It creates calculation. It creates a mind that understands one brutal truth. In this world, you either control fear, or you become controlled by it. While in captivity, Vlad reportedly became quiet, observant, intense. He watched everything. He learned how empires functioned. He studied enemies from the inside. But he also developed something darker: resentment, anger, a deep hunger to never feel powerless again. Years passed, and eventually, he was released. But when he returned home, nothing was the same. His father had been assassinated. His older brother had been captured and buried alive. Just imagine hearing that. Your father, murdered. Your brother, suffocated underground. Betrayed by nobles who once swore loyalty. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was personal. And something inside Vlad snapped. The boy who left as a hostage returned as something else. He didn't just want his throne. He wanted revenge. He wanted control. He wanted a world where no one would ever dare betray him again. And the way he planned to achieve that would change history forever. Because Vlad wasn't becoming a vampire. He was becoming something far more terrifying. A ruler who believed fear was the strongest weapon of all. And he was about to prove it.
When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he didn't return as a hero. He returned to chaos. The throne had changed hands. Nobles were fighting each other. Enemies surrounded the kingdom from every direction. And the men who betrayed his father, they were still alive, smiling, pretending loyalty. Vlad understood something immediately. If he ruled gently, he would die quickly. So he chose a different path. He chose fear. Not ordinary fear, unforgettable fear. In 1456, Vlad finally took the throne, but he knew the greatest threat wasn't foreign armies. It was the powerful nobles inside his own court, the same type of men who had betrayed his father. So he invited them to a grand feast. They ate, they laughed, they celebrated the new ruler. Then Vlad stood up and asked them a simple question. How many princes have you served? Some answered honestly, 10, maybe more, because rulers in Wallachia didn't last long. They were removed, assassinated, replaced. Vlad looked at them calmly, and then he gave the order. The older nobles were impaled on the spot. The younger ones were forced into brutal labor, building one of his castles. Many died from exhaustion. Just like that, the political elite was wiped out. It was brutal, but it sent a message. Betray me, and you won't live long enough to regret it. From that moment on, Vlad ruled with an iron will, stealing, impaled, lying, impaled, cheating the poor, impaled. Even minor crimes could end in death. But here's the strange part. Crime almost disappeared. There's an old story told in Romania. They say Vlad once placed a golden cup in the center of the town square. Solid gold, valuable enough to change a man's life. And he left it there, unprotected. For years, no one touched it. Not because they were honest, but because they were terrified. Fear had become law.
But Vlad wasn't just cruel for control. He believed he was cleansing his land. At the time, Wallachia was surrounded by powerful enemies, especially the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans demanded loyalty and heavy taxes. They wanted obedience, but Vlad refused to bow. And that refusal would lead to one of the most terrifying chapters of his life. When Ottoman envoys came to his court, they refused to remove their turbans as a sign of respect. It was their tradition. Vlad respected tradition, but he also demanded obedience. So he ordered their turbans nailed to their heads, not as a joke, not as a warning, as punishment. The message was clear. In his land, he was absolute. Stories like this spread quickly. Some were exaggerated, some were likely true. But one thing became undeniable. Vlad was no longer just a ruler. He was becoming a symbol of terror, but also a symbol of resistance. Because while his methods were cruel, he was standing against one of the most powerful empires on Earth. And soon, that empire would march toward him with an army so large it should have crushed him instantly. But Vlad had something stronger than numbers. He had mastered fear, and what he would do next would shock even the most hardened warriors. By 1462, Vlad had made a dangerous enemy. The Ottoman Empire. This wasn't a small kingdom. This was a superpower, an empire stretching across continents. Its army was massive, disciplined, relentless, and its leader, Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who conquered Constantinople, was not used to being defied. But Vlad refused to pay tribute. He refused to send soldiers. He refused to bow. So the Sultan decided to end him. An enormous Ottoman army marched toward Wallachia. Some estimates say 60,000, maybe more. Compared to them, Vlad's forces were tiny. On paper, this wasn't a war. It was an execution. But Vlad didn't fight like other rulers. He didn't meet them in open battle. He attacked at night. He burned villages before the Ottomans could take supplies. He poisoned wells. He used guerrilla warfare long before the term existed. He wanted the Ottoman soldiers exhausted, hungry, paranoid. And then came the night attack. Under complete darkness, Vlad and his men slipped into the Ottoman camp. No warning, no mercy. Chaos exploded. Screams filled the air. Soldiers woke up confused, cutting down their own men in the panic. Vlad aimed for one target, the Sultan himself. He almost reached him, almost ended the war in a single strike. But the Sultan survived, and the massive army kept marching toward Vlad's capital. That's when they saw it. At first, it looked like a strange field. Dark shapes rising from the ground. But as they moved closer, the smell hit them. Rotting flesh. Thousands of bodies. Impaled. Men. Soldiers. Some still wearing Ottoman armor. Stakes driven through their bodies. Lined up in rows. Stretching as far as the eye could see. A forest. Not of trees, but of the dead. Some historians say there were 20,000 bodies. Whether that number is exact or not doesn't matter. It was enough. Enough to stop an army in its tracks. Imagine being a soldier, marching confidently toward victory, and then seeing thousands of your own kind displayed like warnings, not buried, not honored, displayed, silently accusing you, whispering what might happen next. Even hardened warriors were shaken. The Sultan himself reportedly walked through the field in silence. He had conquered great cities. He had seen war. But this was psychological warfare at its peak. It wasn't just about killing. It was about breaking the mind. Vlad understood something most rulers didn't. Fear spreads faster than fire. And that day, fear spread through the Ottoman ranks. Some sources say the Sultan began to reconsider the campaign. Others say he eventually withdrew for strategic reasons. But one thing is certain. The image of that forest stayed with them. And Vlad's name grew darker. Across Europe, stories multiplied. Some called him insane. Others called him a genius of terror. But here's the question no one can easily answer. Was he protecting his land? Or had he become addicted to fear itself? Because once he ruled through terror, there's no easy way back. And the more enemies he terrified, the more enemies he created. Vlad had proven he could shock an empire. But shock doesn't last forever. And soon, the tides would begin to turn against him.
By now, Vlad's name was spreading across Europe. But something strange was happening. In Germany, he was described as a bloodthirsty madman. Pamphlets were printed with horrifying stories. They claimed he boiled people alive, that he nailed hats to heads, that he dipped bread in human blood while watching victims die. The stories were detailed, graphic, terrifying. But here's the question. Who was writing them? Many of these accounts came from Saxon merchants, traders who had conflicts with Vlad. He had punished them harshly for refusing his authority. He destroyed their towns, executed some of their leaders. They hated him. And in the 1400s, there was no social media, no fact-checking. If you controlled the printing press, you controlled the story. And these printed pamphlets spread fast. Across Germany, across Europe, turning Vlad into something almost inhuman. A devil in human form. But in Romania, the story was different. There, Vlad wasn't a monster. He was a defender. A ruler who brought order to chaos. A prince who stood against the Ottoman Empire when others surrendered. Some Romanian legends say he protected the poor, that he punished corrupt nobles, that he created such strict justice that even the weakest person could walk safely at night. To them, he wasn't evil. He was necessary. And this is where history becomes complicated. Because both things can be true. He was brutal. There's no doubt about that. Impaling thousands is not mercy. But he lived in a brutal century. Public executions were normal. Torture was common across Europe. Kings and sultans used fear all the time. The difference. Vlad made fear theatrical. He turned punishment into spectacle. He wanted enemies to see it, to smell it, to remember it. And maybe that's why he stands out. But think about this for a moment. If your country was surrounded by powerful empires, if invasion meant slavery, heavy taxes, and loss of identity, if betrayal had already killed your father and brother, how far would you go to prevent it from happening again? Would you choose mercy or survival? That's the uncomfortable part of this story. It forces us to ask, was Vlad cruel because he enjoyed it? Or because he believed it was the only way to keep his land alive? Even historians are divided. Some call him a sadistic psychopath. Others call him a misunderstood military strategist. But one thing is undeniable. His reputation became larger than his reality. And once a reputation like that spreads, it takes on a life of its own.
The line between man and monster begins to blur. And centuries later, that blurred line would inspire a writer searching for the perfect villain. A villain who didn't just rule with fear, but fed on it. And that's when Vlad's story took its final transformation. From prince to legend. From legend to something immortal.
Vlad died in the 1400s. His body disappeared into history. Some say he was buried in a monastery. Others say his grave was empty. His head, reportedly cut off and sent to the Ottoman Sultan, became a trophy. And just like that, the man was gone. But the name survived. For centuries, Vlad was mostly a regional legend. A brutal prince. A controversial ruler. Then, in the late 1800s, nearly 400 years later, something unexpected happened. An Irish writer named Bram Stoker was working on a horror novel. He wanted a villain unlike anything readers had seen before. Not just a monster, but an aristocrat. Intelligent, charming, deadly. He researched Eastern European folklore. He studied old histories. And somewhere in those texts, he found a name, Dracula. He discovered that the name meant son of the dragon, but he also saw something else. In some translations, Dracul could be linked to the word devil. That was enough. The name sounded powerful, dark, ancient, so he used it. But here's the truth. Bram Stoker didn't copy Vlad's life. The vampire we know, the pale figure with fangs, sleeping in coffins, drinking blood, that wasn't historical fact. That came from folklore, from superstitions about the undead, from stories whispered in villages about creatures that rose from graves at night. Stoker blended it all together. He took the name of a brutal prince and attached it to a supernatural predator. And suddenly, Vlad was no longer just a ruler. He was immortal. The novel Dracula, published in 1897, became a sensation. Readers were terrified. The idea of a refined nobleman who fed on blood was irresistible. And over time, the fictional Dracula overshadowed the real one. Movies followed. Black capes, sharp fangs, castles covered in fog. The image became iconic. But think about this. The real Vlad didn't drink blood. There's no evidence he believed he was undead. He wasn't hiding in coffins. He was fighting wars in daylight. Yet somehow, his name became forever linked with darkness. And here's the strange twist. The fictional vampire feeds on blood to survive. The real Vlad used blood to send a message. One is fantasy. The other is history. But which one is more disturbing? A supernatural creature who kills because it must? Or a human being who chooses terror as a strategy? That's why the legend worked so well. Because deep down, we know humans are capable of things far scarier than monsters. Bram Stoker gave the world a villain, but history had already given him the perfect name. And from that moment on, Dracula was no longer just a prince. He became eternal. But before we end this story, there's one final question. What does Vlad's life really tell us about power? About fear? About the thin line between hero and monster? Let's finish this. Fear can build a throne, but it can't protect it forever. By the mid-1470s, Vlad's power was fading. Years of war had drained his kingdom. Enemies had multiplied. Even allies had grown cautious of him. Ruling through terror creates obedience, but it rarely creates loyalty. At some point, the tides turned. Vlad was captured and imprisoned for years. Some accounts say he was betrayed again. Others suggest political strategy forced his removal. History isn't perfectly clear, but one thing is certain. The man who terrified thousands spent years locked away. And then, almost unexpectedly, he returned. For a brief moment, he reclaimed the throne of Wallachia. It was his third time ruling, but this time felt different. The world had shifted. His enemies were still watching, and the Ottoman Empire had not forgotten. In 1476, Vlad rode into battle once more. No castles, no forest of the dead, just a battlefield. And somewhere in that chaos, Vlad III, known as Dracula, was killed. Some say he died fighting bravely. Others say he was ambushed. A few accounts even claim his own men mistakenly killed him in confusion. The details are blurred by time, but what happened next is clearer. His head was cut off, preserved, and sent to the Ottoman Sultan as proof. A final message. The dragon's son was dead. Or so they thought. Because here's the strange part. No one knows for certain where his body rests. One monastery believed to hold his grave was opened centuries later. It was empty. No bones, no remains, nothing. And when history leaves space like that, legend rushes in to fill it. That uncertainty fed the myth. It made the story darker, more mysterious. The brutal prince who impaled thousands now had a death wrapped in shadows. His enemies believed they ended him, but in reality, they did something else. They turned him into something larger than life. Because while Vlad the man died on a battlefield, Dracula the legend was just beginning.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.